Welcome to FHFA's last virtual roundtable discussion and final roundtable discussion. This event is being recorded. Today, we will explore access to the Federal Home Loan Bank System in Alaska. My name is Shannon Fountain. I am a senior policy analyst with the FHFA Federal Home Loan Bank's Affordable Housing Branch. And I'm joined today by Gwen Grogan, who is the Associate Director of Examinations in FHFA's Office of Affordable Housing Program Examinations. We would like to thank our roundtable participants and all of you watching on live stream. We've been very pleased with the high level of stakeholder interest thus far. And now I will turn it over to Gwen, who will provide today's opening remarks. Gwen?
Shannon, thank you for the introduction. Let me thank again the roundtable participants for joining us and the guest. Before I make the standard opening remarks, I want to share how happy Shannon and I were to be given the opportunity to moderate this session on Alaska. As two girls growing up in Indiana among the cornfields and the cows, where little is left of its native heritage, Alaska seemed like an amazing place. And as we were doing our research for today's discussion, we are again quite taken by the vastness, beauty, and diversity. We feel honored to engage today's participants whose Alaskan roots are deep and their commitments are strong. Now, more broadly, we have been encouraged by the wide interest in this FHFA initiative, which has included visiting with folks supporting affordable housing, community and economic development, banking, housing finance, and from academia and research. As Shannon noted, this is our final roundtable discussion. FHFA hosted the inaugural roundtable just about 4.5 months ago in Washington, D.C., where we explored questions on mission and purpose of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. A video recording and transcript of that event and other roundtable discussions are available on FHFA's website, and I would encourage anyone watching today to go back and view those discussions. These roundtables are the second phase of our Federal Home Loan Bank System at 100, focusing on the future initiative. In mid-2022, FHFA Director Thompson announced FHFA would begin a comprehensive review of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. We kicked off the initiative with what turned out to be a 3-day, 3-part listening session due to such high level of interest. Videos of that event can also be found on our website for anyone that is interested. Today's roundtable discussion will focus on access to the Federal Home Loan Bank System in Alaska. We welcome bold ideas, and we also welcome recommendations that can be implemented in the near term. I'll also say those aren't mutually exclusive. The Federal Home Loan Bank System has remained a critical source of liquidity since its inception 90 years ago. This is especially true during times of market stress, and particularly for smaller members that often haven't had access to other sources of funding. We would like to explore where and how the banks can expand their scope and their thinking to be creative and to think more broadly about how the banks may help with the affordability pressures that are being felt in all communities today. In this final roundtable discussion, we are going to be asking some questions about the system's role or potential role in addressing housing and community development needs of Alaska and access to the Federal Home Loan Bank System products and services more generally. While our roundtable discussions are with small groups of people, we are live streaming these discussions so that we can extend the reach to as many potential stakeholders as possible. We also believe that it is critical to meet with local constituents to hear about local issues. These discussions so that we can extend the reach to as many, boy, that's what you get when you are reading, topics in addition to concerns that may be shared on a more national basis. We look forward to the discussion today and the feedback and we receive as we wind down the roundtable discussion portion of the FHFA initiative. With that, let me thank the roundtable participants again and turn it back over to Shannon, who will share the guidelines for our discussion today. Shannon.
All right, thank you, Gwen. So I'm going to cover some rules of engagement. Let's start. First, as I mentioned before, Gwen and I will be moderating today's discussion. We will be posing questions to you. We expect and hope that we'll have an open and engaging discussion. No recommendation or view should be considered off the table, and we encourage you to offer differing views and about some important questions that we'll be covering. We also want this to be orderly. When you would like to speak, or if you are asked to speak, please unmute your microphone and mute after you have finished speaking. You may use the raise hand feature to signal that you wish to speak, and that's in the bottom right corner of your screen. Please also keep your cameras on for the duration of the roundtable. We ask that everyone engage, knowing that we may not agree on all points, but any differences will be shared in a respectful manner. To ensure that everyone has a turn and we cover each topic, if someone is going long, Gwen or I may interject to keep the conversation moving. This review is meant to give voice to the earnest thinking of the Federal Home Loan Bank System stakeholders and highlight areas for further consideration. We ask that you give your best thinking and not just your thinking of what may be possible. For the benefit of the audience, the roundtable participants have been given a set of prompts that we will reference during the course of this afternoon's discussion. Finally, we have a disclaimer that we need to make you all aware of, and I will have to read that verbatim. We have organized this roundtable to obtain your input on the mission of the Federal Home Loan Banks, including input on several specific questions that were sent to you prior to the meeting. During today's session, FHFA will not discuss the status or timing of any potential rulemaking. If FHFA does decide to engage in a rulemaking on any matters discussed today, this meeting would not take the place of a public comment process. The rulemaking document would establish the public comment process, and you would need to submit your comments, if any, in accordance with the submission instructions in that document. FHFA may summarize the feedback gathered at today's session in a future rulemaking document if we determine that a summary would be useful in explaining the basis of a rulemaking. Anything said in this meeting, and that also includes reactions, nodding, eye rolling, should not be construed as binding on or a final decision by the director of FHFA or FHFA staff. Any questions we have are focused on your understanding or focused on understanding your views and do not indicate a policy or legal position. Participants in today's roundtable may have a financial interest, whether direct or indirect, on outcomes that may affect the Federal Home Loan Banks or their businesses. As Gwen mentioned, today's roundtable will be live streamed on FHFA's website and video recorded. FHFA may also prepare a transcript of today's session, which would include the names of all speakers and organizations they represent, if any. The recording and any transcripts prepared will be posted on FHFA's website and YouTube channel, along with any materials being presented today or otherwise submitted in conjunction with the roundtable. Done with that. All right, so we're going to shift over to our introductions. And I would like to start with Carol. And just let me ask that you introduce yourself and your affiliation with the FHLBank System, whether that be in your current capacity or in a former capacity. And I'll let you take it away, Carol. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm Carol Gore. I'm a forever Alaskan of Aleut descent, an enrolled tribal member of the Ninilchik Traditional Council. My relationship to Federal Home Loan Bank was on the AHAC committee, the advisory committee, when the Seattle Federal Home Loan Bank existed. My organization, Cook Inlet Housing Authority, is a tribally designated housing entity and a frequent applicant for HP. Cook Inlet Lending Center, our CDFI, is also a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. Thank you.
All right, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Lauren McVeigh. I'm CEO of True North Federal Credit Union, based in Juneau, Alaska. We're a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, and also I am the member director for the state of Alaska. So I am on the board of the Des Moines Bank.
Chris, I'll let you go next.
Good morning, I'm Christopher Perez. I'm the Vice President of Programs at Rasmussen Foundation, which is the state's largest private philanthropy. I currently serve on the AHAC, the Affordable Housing Advisory Council for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines. And in my day job, I am a frequent side-by-side investor with the Federal Home Loan Bank AHP program. I think probably 3 to 4 out of 5 of the awardees in the state of Alaska, I will have joint or side-by-side investments with.
Thank you. Elena.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Elena Peterson. I am Tlingit and I live in Sitka, which is down in Southeast Alaska. And I'm the executive director for Spruce Root, which is a certified native CDFI providing lending to small businesses and entrepreneurs here in our region. I don't have any affiliation with FHFA or we're not members. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation today. Thank you.
And Colleen.
Hi, Killa. Good morning. My name is Colleen Dishkin. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for the Association of Alaska Housing Authorities. Our association is a membership organization, and our members include the 14 regional housing authorities in the state that represent affordable housing for 196 tribes. So thank you for having me today. I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you all for your introductions. So we're going to dive into our session topics, and I will let Gwen start us off.
Thank you, Shannon. Today we'll frame our discussion around 3 broad topics. First, getting a better understanding of the opportunities and challenges in Alaska. Then moving on to perspectives on the current role of the Federal Home Loan Bank System in Alaska. And finally, wrapping up with ideas for the future role of the Federal Home Loan Bank. So let's get started. The first topic, what are the opportunities and challenges with respect to affordable housing, community development, and economic development in Alaska? And I open it up. Is there anybody who wants to kick us off on that discussion? Okay. My parents were both teachers, so I'm happy to select someone. Elena, could you get us started?
Sure thing. Yeah, I saw Colleen raise her hand, but I'm happy to jump in. I mean, affordable housing, just like everywhere, it's tough, but I think we're unique in Alaska, but I know most specifically about Southeast is the cost of living, the cost of construction. You know, not only is it we have to ship everything up here, but for a lot of our communities, because they're rural, you're also importing all the labor. So by the time you look at the cost to actually construct or rehab or do any type of work, it doesn't usually pencil out, and it's really tough to find financing options for that. And I know where we live, a lot of the communities here are also facing issues on land. You know, there's no land available, or if there is land available, you know, to purchase that land right now, it's expensive, and so again, a project just becomes unaffordable when you stack all those factors on top of each other. I would also just mention that it's hard to have like a one a cookie cutter solution because each community is so different. Energy needs are a big factor here. So one community, it might make a lot of sense to do, heat pumps or certain type of heating source in a home, but for another community that wouldn't make sense because of the high cost of electricity. So it just depends on where different communities are getting their energy sources. And I know that can be difficult when trying to create solutions because those cookie cutter, solutions just don't work. We really have to go community by community to look at what works. And that can be a strain on resources and on a time constraint for people that are trying to help, figure out those solutions. And workforce development needs are huge. Even if we had all the financing and, could figure it all out and had the ability to construct new homes, there's not really many people to do that work. At least here in Southeast, like I said before, you'd have to import it. But then also, we're sharing people in our communities that have those different skill sets. And they get burnt out and they kind of move on. And so trying to build a workforce that can meet the needs of both maintenance and construction, those are big issues. And then there's all the sort of side industries that are connected as well, also having very similar constraints with workforce. And, we're a region of 70,000 people across a geographic area that's as large as the Florida Panhandle. And so that's a lot of area to cover with few people, but the needs are great. And so a lot of our communities are struggling, and the people that live there don't want to leave, but they're facing those tough decisions of how can I continue to live in this place that is my home and recognize that I don't have a lot of options here, or my family doesn't have a lot of options here. There's multiple generations living under one household, and oftentimes those kind of scenarios just lead to a lot of out-migration. And so that's the other thing we're facing. So trying to solve this, solve these constraints soon is really important because the out-migration was exacerbated when the pandemic hit, and we were already dealing with it prior to that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies, Colleen. Your hand raised sort of blended into the background, and I didn't mean to miss you. So I'll suggest we turn it over to Colleen, and then I see Lauren's hand up, and we'll move to Lauren after that.
No problem. So when I think about opportunities and challenges of housing development in Alaska, I think our challenges are great. We have transportation, logistical challenges. The cost of construction, as Elena had said, is astronomical, but we also have opportunities, and I see opportunities in our members, where our members are developing in the most remote, harsh communities, and they're doing so and they're achieving that through economies of scale. So we have very diverse regions. The interior has 34 tribes, I think, and ABCP has over 50. And so they really have figured out how to develop throughout their communities in a way that works best for their communities. When I also think about opportunities, I think about how our communities are able to decide what's best and what's going to fit in their communities. And so I additionally think that opportunities that came in through some big federal investments to expand our infrastructure in our communities is huge, and pulling that into the housing in general. I mean, housing was left out of the bigger packages, but at the same time, how do we get those resources to our communities and into the homes that are being built? And I could talk about challenges all day, but I really think that the housing authorities are meeting those challenges, facing them head on, and they're really just providing the homes in the communities for what's best in their communities. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I believe I said Lauren could speak next, and then we'll move to Carol.
Yeah, thank you. I think Elaine and Colleen have touched on, I think, a tremendous amount of very valuable information. And I was going to stress the transportation because I don't think that you necessarily can really understand the challenges of getting resources to these communities until you understand that for, Southeast, there is no road system. It's all by boat or by ferry, which is even more limited now. Or, you could be up north where the roads come and go, depending on what time of year it is. And so costs are a totally different creature. And so any sort of assessment or vibe of like a program has to understand, right, that a typical allocation of costs might not work for those programs to be successful. And in urban areas, flipping gears in terms of housing, in Juneau and Anchorage, there's one kind of housing issue where, there is limited land, and now development is more vertical because there's limited land available. And then you get out to the more rural communities where, they have new environmental challenges based on global warming. And so it's very unique in every location. So similar need, very different causes and dynamics. Would just be all I would add.
Thank you. Carol?
Thank you. I'm going to try to add something that haven't been elevated yet. I think about Alaska as being urban, rural, and remote. When you think about the accessibility of our communities, whether you're in Southeast or you are in the Bethel region, the Chilista region, there is literally no road system to connect. That means our housing is expensive. You're going to hear that a lot probably during this session. When I think about the expense of housing, I also think about typically in a rural location, people live there because it's less expensive to live there. That is not the case in Alaska. In Alaska, it is more expensive to live in rural and remote areas than it is in urban settings. The cost of living and the wages is a mismatch for those communities. What that means is the tribally designated housing entities, and there are 14 in this state, are really the secret sauce for bringing community and economic opportunity to every community. If you can imagine having 229 communities, all with a variety of cultures, all with a variety of needs, none of them the same, and then trying to knit together both capital and operating sources to provide housing in a state where the private market is not active. The tribally designated housing entities are really the tool for delivering housing, and we've been at it since 1974. We have the capacity. I think Colleen elevated that. I just want to speak to, my organization is in Anchorage. We are probably the most active builder in the entire state. I'm not especially proud of that. That should not be what's happening in this state. The reason it's happening that way, our capital stacks are 8 to 12 sources. I want to say for the record, Federal Home Loan Bank is the tail wagging the dog in that capital stack. So as we look at compliance for every single source of money that we bring to the table, and we think about the complexities that we have to manage, we are bifurcating things like income because you have special requirements that relate to income. We're bifurcating in senior housing related to age because your definitions don't line up. When you think about some of those smaller entities that are trying to deliver housing and those kinds of complexities, it's a significant barrier. The money matters. Your recent increase of funding to $1 million can deliver a single home in some of our highest cost areas, and that matters. We may have a chance to get to a scale of 2 homes in a community instead of 1. So, that is important in our region. So I wanted to elevate that. And maybe the last thing I would elevate is climate change is alive and well in Alaska. We are leading edge in climate change. That means entire communities are trying to find ways to relocate because their homes are literally sliding away. When we think about the immense cost, not just to their community, but also to their culture and to what is their economy when they relocate? They're not just relocating their housing. What about their school? What about a store? What about a landing? You know, they don't have docks. So when you think about that immense decision of relocating a community, housing is the first investment everyone thinks of. It is the right first investment, but it means that we have to be able to leverage that housing and bring in other investments that bring the other things that are critical to a community and that economy. And I think I will just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, we don't want to leave you out of the conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Not so much add, but I just want to put a little bit of like Alaska context to some of these things, because I've been here 15 years. Before that, I worked predominantly in the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines footprint, and mostly in Indian country. And I'm still surprised about how little people understand about how very different Alaska is. Yeah, it's massive. We started that way, but I mean, just to understand the massiveness of it, you know, if you superimpose Anchorage over St. Louis, the state's going to touch the Florida border. It's going to hit San Francisco. It's going to cover the whole upper Midwest. But yet it's small, right? And it's remote. And what does that mean? You heard folks saying, well, there's no roads here. That 80+% of our communities do not have road systems. So that has a whole host of issues about how you get things places. But it also is one of the few, I think it's the only one of 2 states where more than 40% of the population live in the main urban center. So to Carol's point, there's the urban-rural divide, not even getting into the remoteness of it. But when we think about Alaska, it's far from homogeneous. There's the median size of a community is about 300 people. So just pause on that when you're thinking about housing development at any scale, and how a capital stack would work for development. There's only about 50 places that have a population of more than 1,000 people, census designated places. So these are intrinsic challenges. I know Colleen said she didn't want to talk too much about challenges, but the landscape assessment is very different than anywhere else. I have the privilege of being on the AHAC committee, looking at the other 13 or 12 states, and there's so many similarities that I actually don't enjoy, but there's so many differences that I spend most of my time explaining. So I feel obligated to explain that a little bit to the agency, because people think they know, but they don't. I mean, yes, it's expensive, but we really only track cost of living in Anchorage, Juneau, Kodiak, and I don't know, probably Fairbanks. And those are 4 of the top 10 most expensive places to live on a cost of living index. Only, followed by Honolulu, Seattle, and Portland. And I do want to mention that because, again, talking about the footprint of the Des Moines Bank, it feels familiar for us Anchorage folks when we sit down with the folks in Portland and Seattle, and especially Honolulu, and look at what does that mean for trying to do business. And again, to the last point, just to put some numbers to it, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, there's 178 communities that are designated of imminent danger of becoming uninhabitable. You heard the number 229 before. There's 229 federally recognized tribes. That's about 40% of the whole country. Just do the math on that. 178 of 229. That's more than 75% of our communities are threatened by climate change. And 40 of those are designated to be at risk in the next 10 years of being essentially forced relocation if that's an option for the community. So those are the big challenges. It's a very different place. I didn't even get to the fact that like in Anchorage and Juneau, we have the 5th highest per capita rates of homelessness. So it's, you know, it goes Eugene, Seattle, New York, LA, San Jose. We're right in the middle of there in Anchorage and Juneau for homelessness, which is clearly a housing issue. So I spend a lot of time thinking like, how do you deal with these opportunities? And Carol and Colleen Larry, the system here seems to work as best it is because it has local knowledge, indigenous knowledge with a small I. But yeah, there's some challenges. You know, we only have 13 members in the Federal Home Loan Bank in the state. So, you know, what can the bank system do is a good question when all of what I described is really served by 13 fairly regulated institutions, half of which I think are credit unions. So I just want to set that out because you're going to hear these themes, and I know this group very well. So they're gonna keep knitting these things, but some additional context I think is always helpful.
Thank you, Chris. You know, I had a little checkoff list of the things that I had researched, and I think you've covered all of them except for one that I was a little bit curious about, and that was, was there any challenges that came out of through the pandemic that maybe hadn't been identified before?
I'm going to tackle this one because there's macro questions and then there's regional questions. So what's really, I think, critical to know, and people seem to forget, especially in the lower 48, is that in the 4 to 6 years, depending on your measurements, we were in a recession entering the pandemic. The rest of the country was financially and economically on fire. You know, places in the Federal Home Bank of Des Moines footprint were experiencing sub 3 and 2 and 1% unemployment rates, the lowest historical. Whereas we entered the pandemic, especially in Anchorage, but also in our rural communities, which haven't changed much, 2 to 3 times sort of the national average of unemployment. I think Carol can talk to this. In Anchorage, we saw a significant outmigration pre-pandemic of our skilled labor force. It just made more sense to swing a hammer in Idaho than it did here. So the pandemic actually did a couple things. One, we were experiencing a decade of outmigration and population loss up into the pandemic. And it kind of locked us in place a little bit in 2020. Elena said that folks were moving out of Southeast, and that's true, but they were mostly staying in the other places, Anchorage, Fairbanks, the Valley, because there was nowhere to go, and you know, families were unemployed. So as coming out of the pandemic, it was kind of nice to see that we were no longer lagging as much as we were because everyone was depressed. But we're back to, you know, 50 to maybe even 100 basis points more on unemployment rate, combined with low interest rates previously. You know, it really made this mix of buying a home, affording a home, and leaving a calculation that was just hard to figure out what was happening. You know, we saw a vacancy rate decrease for the first time in a long time during the pandemic, and then that's sort of changed. I think the ramifications of COVID are we never came to terms as a state with our economic distress, because the whole country kind of went into distress and then they emerged, but we were there long before them, and we don't really have a plan to emerge. We've been deficit spending as a state for 6 years now. these are all going to be major limitations on economic development, economic growth as we figure out the new normal out there. Now, regionally, Colleen and Carol and Elena can talk about how their communities are even harder impacted than sort of the macro levels, where, you know, communities have had a labor force participation rate of, you know, 50% or an unemployment rate of 10 to 14% historically, and that didn't change during the pandemic.
Thank you, Chris. Looking at the time, I'd like to go ahead and move on over to the second of our bigger questions, and that is the current role of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. Just a couple of details there that it's about a third of the membership in Alaska that does access advances and letters of credit. So there may be opportunities there as well. AHP has approved approximately $31 million in grants, which have assisted 3,200 households. We would appreciate hearing your perspectives and observations regarding the role that the system has played in Alaska. Lauren, I'm wondering if we could kick it off with you as a member of the Board of Directors of Des Moines.
Yeah, you know, I think that the Home Loan Bank plays an important role, but limited. And, you know, the AHP program, you know, has, I think, a ton of potential, but it is complex and it's difficult and it's very costly to administer, right? I mean, the tail on those programs is long and can really only be sustained by organizations that have that infrastructure established. When you talk to other organizations that haven't yet accessed the programs, you know, and they're looking at it, and Carol, first of all, you have far more qualified people at this roundtable than I to speak to this issue, but you know, it's a smaller amount for more money, right? So I think that there are limitations based on the way AHP is administered, but I think that there's a lot of potential there. I think that's where I would leave it and turn it over to someone else who's worked with it more intimately on that level.
Could you talk a little bit about advances and in Alaska?
Yeah, so you know, first of all, the value of the home loan bank and the ability to draw from the bank is in the advances, but also just in the ability to advance, right, if we need it. And so I think that the credit unions and banks in the state are well managed. They are generally liquid, but they're very appreciative of the fact that the bank is there. Some borrow actively, some don't. You know, but they view the bank as a valued member. They view the bank as a critical part of their balance sheet management strategies. The feedback is, you know, consistent on that point, that the bank is a critical part of their ALM management.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on this topic?
I'll just add, as the sort of this cross section between serving on the AHAC, hearing from the bank itself, being Alaskan, and having some work in banking writ large. The value proposition of the Federal Home Bank systems in Des Moines around serving its members in liquidity makes sense. I do go back to the fact that there are products there that are just going to be difficult to use given macro trends, right? I've been talking with probably 5 of the 7 members about community investment advances. You know, when rates were low, it didn't seem worth the administrative burden. rates have back up. There's a spread there that makes sense, but there's no need because we're flush with liquidity in a lot of places. And there's just no houses. Like, we're just not seeing any turn. Like, why would you, the overnight rates are gonna, I mean, the liquidity needs are gonna just be small, given the volume that we're seeing in a place like this, especially accounting for those earlier economic trends where we have high unemployment, an unstable, I don't know who's listening in, but an unstable state government, probably unsustainable state government. I mean, let's just call it what it is. We don't know what's going to come out of June of the session, but I don't think it's going to be a plan to fix how we all live here. And that's going to cause additional, I think, out-migration. And then when I joined the AHAC, I'll say this to Carol, my contact person, Jennifer at the bank side, is like, I was just shocked after 13 years of doing housing deals in the state, how reliant developers, especially in Anchorage and Fairbanks, have become on AHP. That should not, the reliance on this scarce resource with high burdens of participation should not be a thing, but it is. And I've seen deals here fail or get shelved for 2 to 3 years just because they couldn't get AHP money, because they've gone through every other capital source, including multiple layers of debt or deeds of trust grant related. Sometimes I'm in 5th position on a loan because everyone else wants a position on a grant. So I wonder how to address those needs from the system side, from the Des Moines side here.
Thanks, Chris. Carol, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I want to just say a couple of things, and Chris, I appreciate your comments. When I think about Federal Home Loan Bank members in Alaska, when we work on HP and CIA funding, it's relationship driven. So many of our communities do not have a bank to develop a relationship. And so it's much more difficult for some communities in Alaska to actually be successful in an AHP grant. And most of them don't even know CIA exists. I want to say a couple of things. Pre-pandemic, we built a lot of the same buildings. We are limited by how much we can apply for in funds. We have building codes, so we just kind of keep it simple and maybe change the colors and a little relief. Pre-pandemic, a building that cost us $9 million cost us $16.5 million. Same building, same similar location, $16.5 million. That's the type of gap we're trying to fill. Pre-pandemic, we were able to carry about 16% in debt. Our last building was 8%. I don't think we're going to be able to hit 8% debt in our next building between the depth of our capital stacks, the lack of increase in rents here because of our economy, and the increases in interest rate. The $10 million cap on CIA for member banks is unrealistic in Alaska. It just simply doesn't make sense. They can do maybe 5 transactions. And we are regularly trying to figure out how to manage our debt within that CIA cap because there are literally no other opportunities in this state for debt. Now, we are more complex, possibly because of more complex than rural Alaska, where maybe their capital stacks are 4 or 5. But making that simple, when we say it's the tail wagging the dog, I think your opportunity is thinking bigger as an organization. Your funds are rarely the only funding source plus one. If you think about that and how much of your funding is already being knit together with other federal funds, there ought to be a way to come up with some commonality that makes it easier on the applicant side of the equation. Simple things like definitions. I will tell you, my entire term on the AHAC in Seattle was on tribal affiliation. It took 3 terms to get that passed. And how I got that passed was I found a tribal affiliation definition within the Federal Home Loan Bank System with the Bank of Des Moines. And we got permission to use that. So I think sometimes we study our navel, and I would just say it's possible to keep it simple while still being in a good regulatory framework. And I would encourage Federal Home Loan Bank to look at that opportunity.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on one of Carol's points? AHP,
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
AHP, down payment assistance, we really only have 1 or 2 bank sponsor players in those programs. You know, I shudder to think, and I don't know if anyone's on this call, like what happens if Northrim gets bought out? I mean, it's just like, I will shop around projects to my contacts at the banks, and they're not sponsors, there's not debt. State agency, we only have 1 state agency that serves both development, public housing, and finance, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. You know, so when they have capital money flowing from the feds and grant support, there often isn't a bank participation in the deal. But AHP would be nice. And the banks, like I said, 14 members, 1 just merged, 13 members. Most of them are credit unions. They're not going to do multi-family commercial financing. It's such a limited relationship-based effort. That being said, the banks here do have, because of the size and scale of the state and their locations, a better understanding of what's going on in local communities. They understand the high costs, they understand community politics, they understand how to have the developers or the nonprofits or the tribes work on these projects. And that's
Thank you.
we're just gonna have to rely on those members too as we go forward, which is an interesting proposition.
Thank you, Chris. I think to be sure that we have plenty of time to talk about the future role of the Federal Home Loan Bank System, I'm going to hand it off to Shannon now to guide us through that discussion.
All right, thank you, Gwen. So now we're going to pivot, as Gwen said, to the future role, which has really been the basis of all of these many discussions, roundtable meetings, on-site meetings, listening sessions, you name it. So we are talking about the future. We call this the system at 100. So the banks will hit their centennial in less than 10 years now. So we want to think ahead. So we want to hear from you about how the system can expand access to its resources in Alaska. And we'll look to the future role of the banks and how they may undertake or what can be undertaken to respond to the challenges that we discussed. And some of the themes that I've heard are, a few number of members. I mean, as Chris has pointed out, access to the bank's products and services, a low number of members that are participating and that are accessing those products and services, limited products and services. So there are products out there, but they don't really match or fit with what the needs are, limited partnerships, limited relationships. So I want you all to just sort of, think broadly, think innovatively, on, what can the bank system do? What can it be to support these needs? And I want to start with, let's see, I'm going to start with Lauren. And so as we're thinking about future role, we want to think about, what structural barriers may be at play, and what will prevent the bank system from working most effectively. And Lauren, you made submitted a response that I wanted you to maybe expand on as we were asking about structural changes, with consolidation or size or membership of the banks. You said that while there's never a good time for change, right now maybe the poorest time to make a change. So share your thoughts on that. I want to understand more about that, and for the audience, and then anyone else who would like to jump in there on structural barriers that we may face, and how can we overcome those?
Yeah, I think, obviously liquidity is sort of a critical topic these days when it comes to financial institutions. And, while many of us coming out of the pandemic and all of the money and the swell in deposits and liquidity, that is diminishing. And so liquidity has rapidly become a real topic of conversation. And certainly we've seen in the national news over the course of the past week that it's an important one. The interest rate environment with the rapid increase over 2022 has put some balance sheets out of kilter. We've got inability or profound impacts from liquidating, upside down investments. And so the role of the Federal Home Loan Bank from the member financial institution perspective in terms of being a keystone of our liquidity management is even more important now than ever before. So when I say now is a particularly poor time to be changing the engine while the plane is in flight, I think that's the first fear that comes to mind, right? And when I look at my balance sheet and how I manage, we want to keep lending, and we are lending. And Chris, we really need to talk. But in order to know that we, can keep that up, we have to know that our resources are going to be available to us. So that was what I was alluding to there.
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on structural barriers and what can we do to overcome those?
I'll jump in. I don't, I'm the least familiar with the existing programs of the folks on the panel, but something that comes up again and again with the communities that we serve is eligibility. And so when you're looking at, median household income or census data, our communities, especially in Southeast, the census data does not accurately reflect the reality in a community. And it's due to how that data is collected and how those numbers get, different communities get pulled together. And so I would just flag that as something to know about Alaska. Housing is, so if we could figure out housing in Alaska, I get to work across many different industries and sectors. If we could figure out the housing piece, everything else can start to come together. There's just so much opportunity in Alaska and a lot of excitement around growth in energy sector, tourism, visitor industry sector, and many others. And I just think that, housing is always the common theme and the thread across everything. It's like housing and energy. And so I think a lot about, well, what's preventing communities or people in communities solving that? And a lot of times it's just the qualifications, and it'll oftentimes come all the way back to the census data that's collected and whether or not they qualify. And so a median household income, of $80,000 a year for a household of 4 people it's not a livable wage in the communities where we live. Like those people are hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, barely getting by. But then they may not qualify for whatever the program is. And so there's things there to know as well. And again, I'm not as familiar how that impacts the funding that comes through FHB, but I think that's something to note as a structural issue.
Thank you. Carol, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. I want to elevate just a couple of things, maybe tag on to what Elena said. When you think about 30% AMI, it's defined in a variety of different ways that are often in conflict. That's particularly challenging for Alaska because of the permanent fund dividend. A larger family, they might get zeroed out of any program based on whatever that PFD might be for that year. Calculations for a Section 8 voucher at 30% are different from 30% calculation for a low-income housing tax credit, are different from Federal Home Loan Bank. So I just want to say when the criteria is check the box of 30%, you're unintentionally leaving out the very people that need help. When you push it to the lowest denominator, in our state, that doesn't always work. I want to say when I read through the packet, you have 13 states in this region. That's very large. And it's very difficult not to be zeroed out within that 13. I don't know, I'm not advocating for an additional Federal Home Loan Bank region, but I am suggesting that maybe the hard work is understanding that there may be some high cost regions, as an example, who have slightly different criteria that help you get more money in the places where it's really needed. That's what I would suggest you think about in a structural way. It's impossible for you to find common ground in those 13. I think Chris articulated that very well. But I think if you look at a variety of those states, there are some states that also have a lot of tribes, and looking at that in a different way, instead of we have to find a solution for all 13, is there a way to sort of slice and dice and maybe look at a combination of states within those regions to get to a different outcome? Thank you.
All right, thank you. So Colleen, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would take a different spin on it because I'm not too familiar with the bank's roles in general, but I am very familiar with the housing authorities in our communities. And really, I think if we're talking about structural change and we're talking about strategies and what might changes that might be made, to me, I feel like the membership of the Federal Home Loan Bank doesn't include our communities as a whole. We do have Cook Inlet as lending center as a member, but it's like, how is the bank reaching our communities? And I think thinking through that, we don't have banks in our communities. They're small. The majority don't have a credit union. They don't have Wells Fargo. And so like I think I had mentioned in my comments, it's like the relationship between the housing authorities and the banks are like a corporate relationship. It's not about their CRA credits going into communities, for example. They're the banking institution, and it's not about accessing other resources that are available to our communities, because that's just not how they're functioning. So structurally, I don't know what that looks like, but I think understanding that there are barriers to our communities and these programs getting into a larger community of Alaska is something that the banks can think about.
And Chris, before I jump to you, Colleen, I was saving this for later, but you just kind of brought up the point. In your comments, you talked about the connections between the housing authorities and the banking institutions being focused on traditional banking relationships. And I think that's the point you're making, is that that's not the mission related work is not really the focus. So I want to just put this out there. How do we shift that? How do we shift that relationship between these entities so there can be more focus on needs that are outside of just your traditional banking needs? What are some ideas that anybody has?
I don't know if I have any ideas off the top of my head. You know, and I guess I wouldn't say that not all of them are, you know, but I just think that banking in general in our communities is just missing. So I just put that out there.
Carol?
I would add maybe one point, which is the bank, even if it's CRA, has to believe that they're making a good investment. And when you think about what does a bank traditionally do to measure a good investment, they're looking at things like appraisals. Appraisals don't work in our state. So some of the traditional tools that a bank has to measure whether or not it's a good investment don't work in our communities, and probably don't work in tribal communities just generally. Appraisals are very, very difficult. I think one of the stories I heard that might be worth sharing here was a gentleman that moved to, I can't remember if it was Kotzebue or Nome, and they were willing to build a new home because there wasn't anything else. That community needed that person in a leadership role. That home cost $850,000 to build. When he got the appraisal was around $500,000, which meant he had to bring 20% of the 500 plus cash to fill the gap, with a hope that he would never ever get that additional money out. So how a bank looks at investing in our tribal communities has to change if we're going to be an investment from that member bank beyond just deposits. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren, and then Chris, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity for a lot of conversation here. You know, Carol's absolutely right. We have regulations and we have people who are watching very carefully to see, you know, what we're doing and what our programs look like. And but at the same time, you know, I think that there's things that we are doing that maybe are more localized and could be broadened and spread to other communities. So I think there's an opportunity to get kind of everyone together at a conversation and see what we can do, just ourselves as credit unions and banks, and then through the FHLB programs as well. So I see a summit in our future.
Chris, I want to jump back to you.
Sure. So, right. So you asked about structural. So we jumped a little to programmatic too. And I think there's the two are conjoined for the practitioners on the call as well as me. But on the structural side, you know, I'm pointing down the hall and I'm pointing to Carol too, because I find it strange that we've divided our federal programs and our quasi-federally regulated institutions like Federal Reserve and the Federal Home Loan Bank into geographic territories that they don't actually mean anything. Like there's no, you know, I'm not sure why the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago covers a city and a state, you know, a scale just happens to be there. I'm not sure why Region 10, which is our designation for federal programs, is a region other than, you know, maybe expediency of airplane flights, but there's like probably more connectivity between Alaska and Hawaii than there is between Alaska and California in a lot of ways. But I will say, notwithstanding that, what I've been pleased about serving on the AHAC committee is the amount of time and effort the Des Moines Bank and the Seattle Bank before it have spent on trying to learn the distinct yet overlapping needs of the communities. And so without jumping into programs and how that could be addressed, Carol talked a little bit about high cost places. I talked a little about voluntary programs that the bank is launching. I think we got what we got, you know, and it was 100 years ago minus Seattle as these banks emerged. What can we do better? Alaska is strange, right? Because we have so few regulated financial institutions. We have, checking notes, 5 non-regulated CDFIs covering the whole state, all of which are, except for Cook Inlet Housing, Cook Inlet Lending Center, nascent at best. And I say that as a board member of Spruce Root, Elena's group. Comparatively, we're nascent. You know, we're small in size and scale. And as a person who does financing, as I said before, sometimes I'd be in 3rd, 4th, 5th position on a deed of trust. What does that mean for a regulated financial institution? You know, participating with its regs. So the Federal Home Loan Bank, from a community development perspective, from a housing development perspective, structurally can leverage the information it has in its region, whatever that might be. I think Des Moines is doing a fairly good job. But in absence of more members, triggering events for CRA, which I actually don't want, right? Because the triggering events for CRA are going to be acquisitions, they're going to be consolidation, they're going to be things that actually make us less banked as a state. I think we're doing the best we can. So I advise real careful thought about what does it mean for a system to structurally change when we're, you know, in Alaska at the periphery of that system anyway.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to shift a little bit and narrow and ask about, are there any new mission-related programs that the Federal Home Loan Bank System should consider beyond what we've already discussed, but are there any new programs that we should be focusing on? And I also want to throw in there too, because we haven't talked a lot about economic development, but I want to pivot to economic development too and ask, you know, how do we think about in terms of a new role for the Home Loan Bank System to expand in the economic development arena? Colleen, do you want to start?
Sure. It's an interesting question because economic development in a lot of our communities, one of the challenges that we have is, and Elena alluded to this quite a bit earlier, but workforce development. One of the top challenges that we see in our communities with economic development, with workforce development, is housing. So, I mean, that is the underlying issue for a lot of our communities. So, not that I don't think that the FLHB should not invest in economic opportunities for our communities, but understanding that there's a very close-knit link between being able to develop our workforce, being able to expand economic development, and having housing on the ground.
Thank you for that. Carol?
Thank you. I want to validate what Colleen just said. Housing is economic development. Without housing, there is no community, there is no economy. And in our state, that is acutely true. I want to speak a little bit about new programs. So, you know, there's been a lot of, I would say, income targeting to lower income households and individuals at the federal level and the local level. What we've created is a donut hole of no support at all for those that are in our workforce. And when I think about our workforce, we're not talking about people that have wealth. We're talking about people that have 2 jobs in a household. They're above 60% of AMI, and who magically determined that if you are 60% of AMI, you make $1 more, that you no longer need any sort of support. I would say in our state, when I talk to employers, virtually every restaurant in this town is in the housing business because they have no other choice. I think they would be all over an employer-assisted program. I don't know what that means. But I also see a pivot at the federal level to how do we help to fill that donut hole of workforce who no longer has housing. The point that I want to make here is there are significant opportunities, but our buckets are full of specialized programs. There are absolutely gaps in how we serve people. And right now it's income targeting. It might be geography. It might be senior versus homeless. So you've got those sorts of things that we are then trying to serve an entire community. We have special programmed ourselves almost out of economic opportunity. And that's how I see it. I absolutely, as an organization, want to be able to choose to do all of the above. But I have to do that by trying to find resources that serve a target that's not in anyone's menu. They're counting on the private market to take over that workforce donut hole. That's not happening here, and I don't think it's happening anywhere else, or there wouldn't be the deep conversations I see in Washington, D.C. and in Congress. So I want to put a pin in that and say, to the extent that we have more specialized programs, be thoughtful. Don't offer more complication, but also that flexibility, which I think I've said that word a dozen times this morning. We need funding that is flexible, that can adapt to our various communities, not just in Alaska, but throughout the Federal Home Loan Bank system. I think this is a system-wide conversation that Federal Home Loan Bank should have. Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to ask a slightly different question. So we've heard a fair amount about pilot programs and sort of try before you buy opportunities. So can we think of any role for the Federal Home Loan Bank System in launching any pilot programs in Alaska, and what would those programs be?
I'm going to jump in here
Yeah.
because I've had the benefit of 25 plus years in philanthropy, where really our only value is to think about how to best serve organizations, in my case, capital needs, by being flexible and taking risk and thinking about experiments and pilots. So I can name a litany of programs that exist around the country that are private partner public partnerships that are local led. But I do want to re-emphasize, like, the core bread and butter of the Federal Home Loan Bank system isn't just providing capital writ large for economic development, but with a focus on housing, and housing is probably our biggest economic need. So I'm fine with that, but I do think CDFIs are going to increasingly play a role in especially rural economic development. And how that works in Alaska, I'm not exactly sure, other than Spruce Root. And we can talk, Elena talk a little bit about that. But if we treat a CDFI at the Federal Home Loan Bank system level as a quasi-regulated institution that's going to have the same collateralization needs or things like that, it's just, it's just going to work for, I can name 20 CDFIs in the country, and that's it. Boom. And probably half of them are members already. Minnesota, here in, I believe Coogan Lending Center might be the smallest balance sheet among the CDFIs participating. Nice that they're in the mix. But that's where the innovation is going to happen. That's where the risk taking is going to happen. And that's where they're going to be able to leverage funds from organizations like Rasmussen Foundation for some of that risk taking. I do appreciate that the Des Moines Bank has this new voluntary program, really around capacity building. You know, it's trying to get to the root cause of like, why don't we get AHP applications from certain places in certain states? And you know why? I mean, we all know why, but it's the bank finally saying it's because there isn't necessarily the local expertise to run these projects, let alone do the grant writing component, which is a whole nother issue. And I think Colleen could talk about that. I mean, a big workforce issue in this state, and I shake my head as a practitioner, is build up grant writing capacity. Because you look at any one of these federal applications or even the Federal Home Loan Bank, I heard just recently last year, and what I consider an exciting project around homelessness, permanent supportive housing at scale for Alaska, 24 units in Bethel. You know, they took one look at HP and went, no thanks. I mean, they just like, there's no one in the community and we'd have to hire someone, and then the compliance in the back end. So yeah, I think building the capacity to think about capital needs, flows of capital, grant writing, those are all sources. I see the other banks in the system doing innovative pilot projects, and they're pretty great, but they have partners that make sense. I'm not sure we have those partners yet. And if we do, then they're not quite there on the risk side because they don't have a backbone of support anywhere else. Like, I'm not sure Coogan Housing should put its balance sheet on at risk to pilot something to leverage some additional support. There are entities around the country that are better positioned given their long-standing needs, the fact that they're in money centers of locations. But yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunities, and I can rattle some off, but I also want to think what our core mission is, especially in these rural places, and especially for a bank that serves what, 40% of the nation's tribes. What does that mean? And how do we get at that?
Thank you, Chris. Lauren, let's jump to you.
I completely agree that probably one of our largest economic challenges in terms of economic and community development is absolutely housing. Every conversation I have ever been a part of in Alaska about economic development, and there have been a lot of them, housing is always the first barrier. So some of the conversation that's been here today has been about shortage of workforce to build that housing. I can tell you, as someone who, even as simple in Juneau as needing to get housing repairs, even that level of expertise is not available readily. So maybe programs that look at workforce development, maybe programs that support training and certification in the basics. I mean, there are programs out there, but maybe the Home Loan Bank can develop something that would help with that. But also workforce housing, can't stress that enough. It's employers are looking at partnering with other employers, building higher density complexes so that they have a place to put their employees. Maybe programs that would facilitate that sort of partnership so that employers have a place to house employees would be helpful. And then the last potential topic or program type thing to look at would be disaster response, across the state, whether it's mudslides and Haines and up to river erosion and storm damage. I think that there's a lot that happens within a community with lost housing, lost lives, lost community, that maybe some economic support from the bank system could touch.
All right. All right, we are getting close to end of time. We're at 2:20, and I have one more question to kind of talk more about the future. And I want to point to Elena and Chris on this. It's about partnerships. You two work in this space where I'm sure much of your job is cultivating partnerships and knitting those folks together, those entities together. So I want to just ask, are there additional partnerships that should be explored? And, you know, just say if we've already covered it enough, you can certainly say that because we have talked about some partnerships. But I also want to talk about successful models. If you can point to any successful models or partnerships that have useful elements that can be employed in the Federal Home Loan Bank System. So Alana.
Yeah, well, I can talk a lot about partnerships. I think it's been emphasized, you know, through some other comments, like how we could probably strengthen that in the state. But one thing, one model that I think, and something I had written in preparing my thoughts about this topic today was how can FHFA or, FHLB get boots on the ground in the state, so to speak. I find as a small CDFI, when we're looking to work with anyone in a national, sort of scope or federal program, when they have someone in the state that's a liaison or a support person for deploying those programs or those dollars or connecting with the users of those dollars, that's always been really helpful for us, because that person typically is from here, understands all the things that have been shared by the panelists and what's going on in the state, and are really looking for ways, it's their day job. They're waking up and thinking about, how do we get our program deployed here? How do we do this well? And then working with us to understand our limitations and how to help us, complete the application, navigate the system. They are sort of that middle person between the national branch and the state level, and that has always really helped well. And it's a relationship thing, right? It's someone who knows both sides and is sort of playing that role. And when I've seen it most successful, it is someone in the position that's from here, or that is really knowledgeable about the state. So that's one thing. And then I think, just time. I mean, this sort of an opportunity is really wonderful to be able to share thoughts and ideas and, effectively spend time together. And so, I've learned a lot on this call and just reading through the response of some of the other participants that they prepared. And I feel like there's such little activity in our state that to me indicates, just more time together, spending more time in the state, spending more time, with talking with people in the state that are running CDFIs or tribes specifically, how Alaska is set up. I know the panelists know this all too well, but Alaska is set up very differently than the rest of the country when it comes to our tribes and the relationship between ANCSAs, tribes, the federal government, state government. And so there's a lot of unique aspects to how we're set up, and it just takes time and energy to understand. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Chris, did you have anything to add there? We've got a few minutes. Don't
Sure.
wanna rush you.
I think when I think about the landscape here, opportunities for partnerships and who those partners are, there's always been a flow of subsidy money to interesting new ideas in Alaska. In a lot of ways, we are an incubator, dare I say, petri dish of opportunity around how tribal entities, communities, and government works. And for the most part, the banks have not been part of that. They haven't had to date, except for housing, within the Elena, I'll turn to Elena. I don't know how much of Spruce Root's capital stack comes from banks right now, but I don't think we have a bank investor in the Spruce Root capital stack, which is, basically the opposite of how every other lower 48 or tribally designated CDFI is going to operate. So, so we knit things together. There's a lot of opportunity right now for mixed use construction in our population centers, higher density, things like childcare financing. There's going to be a flow of money, and I actually don't see how currently the Federal Home Loan Bank System participates in that, because they're just, they're not bankable given the programs that currently exist. But I think we're going to see increasingly new opportunities and partnerships. We're going to see soft capital sitting around in pots throughout the state, whether it's a housing trust or a childcare financing fund or workforce development fund. We're going to probably take opportunities now to put money when money exists, when capital exists, into projects for the leaner times that we think will probably be coming again. And it will be, I think we'll see. I just got off a call on Friday with the Federal Reserve, San Francisco, trying to figure out what to do in Alaska. So there's clearly some opportunity for knitting these things together. And it really all then comes down to flexibility. Like, what can the banks and the big banks, not the local banks, but the Federal Home Loan Bank System banks do that isn't in conflict with the way they manage their funds. I think Alaska was highly beneficially received funds from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines through a partnership with a foundation, Northwest Area Foundation. They provide capital funding through OESTA. I think that's been the backbone of support for emerging CDFIs in Alaska, including Spruce Root, but also shoring up loan loss reserves and other things like that. There's going to be more need for that in the future if we try and grow economic opportunities. I can't even count. I'm a bad board member to Elena because I can't even count the number of partners, capital providers, people are walking side by side, looking at the growth of this organization at this point. It's tremendous, but each one of them has a separate set of rules. There's lack of flexibility. And then there's new opportunities, like the federal government deemed Southeast a Build Back Better community for mariculture. What is that? $50 million in funds are going to flow into a tiny little industry in hopes to grow it. What does that mean? And how do we think about local bank participation and the bank system participation and things like that, where there's going to be a construct in place, a capital stack construct. And if you care about flow of funds, an opportunity for banks to participate. If we were anywhere else, CRR banks would just jump in immediately. But we don't have that. So I think it goes back to the Des Moines Bank to think about opportunities to participate.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've got about a minute left. And so this will be rapid fire. So I'm going to ask if you had a magic wand and you could identify the single most pressing need that should be considered in addressing all of the challenges, not all, but pick one. What would that be in Alaska, and what could the Federal Home Loan Banks do to address that single most important need? So I'm going to start with Lauren, and you've got the magic wand.
Boy, no pressure. I guess, what I would start with is what I think is readily available, which is that the AHP program with some modification, could be a much more powerful tool within the state, and with complexity and some of the compliance burdens mitigated and more flexibility, just to hit that word again, I think that it would be a more accessible tool and a more affordable tool for agencies throughout the state. So I think that I would just hit that as a key takeaway.
Chris, I'm going to jump to you.
Again, starting from what we know, I'm not gonna wave my magic wand on system-wide issues, but AHP has been a necessary component to bolstering our housing production in the state. It still misses some things. I'm a patient, flexible capital provider that takes operating costs into effect. HP doesn't, but there we are side by side. So how to make it more flexible? Our increasing need around, for me, for housing, and this is a personal thing, is around permanent supportive housing. How do you finance the supportive part? And having AHP be able to at least account for those non-capital higher costs of doing business for certain populations as well as certain locations would be great. So I'm being redundant when I say flexible and patient within the HP program, but that's the biggest thing for me.
All right, thank you. Alana?
This is tough for me. I would say, one is the boots on the ground. I think if you could get like someone in the state trying to answer these questions full time, that would probably be an excellent use of resources. And then I'd say continuing talking with these folks, these other panelists, Chris and Rasmussen this is what they do, and they have a really, maybe that's another strong point of Alaska, is we have such an excellent statewide foundation that really works in a regional way. And so they understand the whole state. They have the relationships with the different CDFIs, the banks, all the other private funders and philanthropy groups. So I think that, there's something there, and maybe like just talk to them, ask Rasmussen, and they'll connect you. They'll know, what to do. I think there's a lot of advantage to us being such a big state, but a small state at the same time. We're only a few people. And so just talk to us and we can figure it out. There's a good opportunity there.
Thank you. Colleen, I'll jump to you.
Thank you. And I think I'll just echo what Chris kind of said, flexible and appropriate funding for our communities. And I will have to say that the Rasmussen Foundation is an amazing group. And I say that in preface of the housing authorities are the boots on the ground, delivering housing in every community in our state. And the AHA members are the executive directors of the regional housing authorities. And so that connection, I think, is one of the most important if you're trying to invest in housing anywhere in Alaska. So I would just say that they're phenomenal, and they are really the experts and truly can provide you all the background and the logistics and the challenges and the opportunities. And they're the ones, I believe, who will bring the most information to FHLB and FHAA.
Thank you. And Carol, last but not least.
I'm going to say 4 things. We've learned that leveraging capacity is almost as valuable as leveraging resources. As an organization, we've supported other organizations for the production of 550 housing units in communities that are not where we typically live and work. So that's one idea. How do you catalyze that leveraging of capacity in our state to help each other? The association works that way together. So it's a ripe topic for us, but you might catalyze us to do more of that. I'd say 3 things: redefining what affordability means today, might lead to more flexibility in how you're examining the program. We've had a lot of conversations about that. Second, if your investments in Alaska are more intentional to increase production, moving a community from building 2 homes to 7 would be miraculous, and then putting the money behind it. You know, we're not getting the scale in most of our communities. So increasing that production and investing in that, you're already building 1. Can we help you build 2 more? You have to put money behind that, but it's going to cost less to build 3 than it will to build 1 on a per unit basis. And lastly, invest in the low cost of debt. That means more today than it did 4 years ago. But it is critical when you pile everything else together, lack of workforce, supply chain issues, and higher cost, and 60% in our case, and you move out of Anchorage and it's even bigger. So making an intentional investment in some low cost interest debt would be a miracle for our state. Thank you for this opportunity today.
And thank you all. And so we are over time, and I apologize. I'm going to shift over to Gwen for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Shannon. Real quickly, in closing, Shannon and I thank you for your time and thoughtful remarks. They really were invaluable for us building our understanding of the challenges you face in Alaska. We also appreciate your generosity in sharing ideas. I would be remiss in not thanking the FHFA staff who have been behind the scenes, making sure that this roundtable, along with all those that preceded it, have been successful. Guys, you've reached the finish line. And finally, as we enter the home stretch for soliciting stakeholder observations, perspectives, and ideas, I encourage everyone to make plans to join the listening sessions that are scheduled for later this week. Thank you for your time today.